Welcome back to talkSPORT USA with myself, Will Varney. Looking forward to a big Sunday night football this weekend live on talkSPORT 2. The Minnesota Vikings going up against the Dallas Cowboys. And look, both of these teams still in the playoff hunts, you could say. Their hopes maybe not realistic, but still a chance. Fascinating encounter. And to give us a bit more insight into the Cowboys season so far, pleasure to say the editor-in-chief, the manager himself, of Blogging the Boys for part of SB Nation, Mr. RJ Ochoa joins us. RJ, how are you?
I'm doing well, Will. I'm not Garrett Wilson, so not the coolest person you've spoken with as of late, but it's nice to be with you and your audience. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, a belated happy Thanksgiving, the most important holiday. As we all know, the world completely respects the United States.
Look, you might not be Garrett Wilson, but trust me, we enjoy your company nonetheless on the channel and your insight. And look, to get stuck into it, really, I mentioned there the playoff aspirations and hopes. There is still a chance for the Dallas Cowboys, 11%. We know what they have to do. They have to win out their final 4 games of the season, hope the Philadelphia Eagles lose 2 of their games to win the NFC East. But overall, what have your reflections been as we head into week 15 of the season for the Dallas Cowboys so far?
Yeah, I think it's been a tumultuous season, and I know you and I have spoken about this. Everything for the Cowboys has felt broken since they lost to the Packers at the end of the 2023 season in that wild card round. Last year felt like the front office intentionally and some would argue maliciously sabotaged the team, and so that really made last year just kind of difficult to even be a part of as a fan. This year inspired a little bit more hope, but obviously the way things got started just kind of rained on that parade. And so when they traded for Logan Wilson, he gets kind of lost in the fold because of the Quinnen Williams of it all. But when they traded for Quinnen Williams, I think that inspired people relative to the future. Even before they ripped off 3 wins in a row, I think everybody began to hold some level of cautious excitement, cautious optimism for this specific seasons that are 2026 and 2027, because those seem to line up with the window that the Cowboys have of operation now with Dak Prescott's career and CeeDee Lamb and contracts and things like that. And so as optimism was kind of getting off the ground, there was the tragedy with Marshawn Kneeland that has kind of made evaluating the football of it all feel rather meaningless for obvious reasons. And so I think everyone has been juggling different emotions for the last month or so. The fact that they beat the Raiders on Monday Night Football right after, they did have their bye, obviously. I think a lot of people thought, man, it's just the Raiders, whatever. How can you really get that excited about this? And then to come back from 21 points against the Eagles really, I think, lifted spirits. And everybody thought, man, if they could just beat the Chiefs on Thanksgiving, that would really kind of go a long way. And it happened. And so I think losing to the Lions, did take some steam out of that process. But the Eagles dropping on Monday Night Football relit that candle. And so Kate McAllister in Home Alone once said that this is the season of perpetual hope. And that's kind of where everyone is right now, is perpetual hope that maybe this can happen, but with a level of excitement that I think the Cowboys are going to win out regardless of what happens with the Eagles. And I apologize for being long-winded. And if they do, that would mean they won 7 of 8 to close the season coming out of the bye. And while, again, we all understand that the Cowboys front office has their ways, that would be a huge and serious sign of promise relative to 2026.
Look, I'm absolutely loving the Home Alone reference that you've just issued there. That, to me, like you said, the season of Christmas, of hope, of joy. And look, we'll touch on the trade deadline and those moves that Jerry Jones and the front office made in a moment. But really, you mentioned there the potential, the journey towards the end of this season, the fact that they've got to win the final 4 games of the season to even give them just a chance. Firstly, how hopeful are you of the Dallas Cowboys doing their part of the job, essentially?
So the 4 games in question, for anyone unaware, are 2 home games and 2 road games. Minnesota and the Chargers at home, and then a short week on the road against the Commanders. That is a Christmas Day game, and Christmas falls on a Thursday this year, so that's why it's a short week. And then on the road a week later to close it out against the Giants. Understanding that divisional games across the NFL are difficult regardless of the teams and the divisions, Dak Prescott has largely owned the NFC East throughout the course of his career, independent of the fact that Washington and New York are kind of moribund at this particular moment. So I would say that everyone has kind of assumed that those two are going to happen, again, in a cautious and measured sort of way. I think that everyone, back when the schedule came out, looked at this part of the schedule, especially coming out of that Philadelphia, Kansas City, Detroit stretch, and said, you'd be lucky to split those games against Minnesota and the Chargers. And they obviously don't have that room for error at this point in time. And so if they win on Sunday night against Minnesota, it will, in my perspective, come down to whether or not they just beat the Chargers. If they win these first two games, I really believe they'll win out to close the season, just again because of the variety of factors that go into those two divisional matchups. But I mean, I can't put it past them, unfortunately, that, they could let JJ McCarthy and the Vikings just kind of have a night, or that they could win this week and relight, a different sector, a different volume of hope, and then drop it next week against the Chargers. And so this is kind of, to me, the more important 2-week stretch. And if they get through it unscathed, then I will feel pretty confident going into the final two.
It was interesting that looking at your social media, you mentioned how regardless of what happens between now and the end of the season, the potential record that the Cowboys finished up with, you said that there were mistakes that had been made in 2025 and also in 2024. I just wanted to get your thoughts on what essentially you thought those mistakes were and how damaging they've potentially been to the fact that this team is now fighting out with an 11% chance of making the playoffs to maybe something that could have been easier, or maybe they'd already secured their spot in the postseason by now.
Yeah, so even if the Cowboys go on to make the playoffs, I mean, I'll be thrilled and I'll be happy both personally and professionally. But that will in no way justify the process. And that would be that if I have a reason in terms of rooting against the playoffs, it would be that to some it would. And that process, you mentioned 2024, I would argue dips and stems all the way back to 2023. If you recall, if your audience recalls, at the end of the 2022 season, the Cowboys had lost in the the divisional round that year to the 49ers, second year in a row that they'd gotten bounced. That was the Zeke Elliott lining up at center game. It was just a total disaster. And Dak Prescott was coming off of his interception late in season, and that would have been the time to get ahead on a Dak Prescott extension and a CeeDee Lamb extension. They did not. CeeDee Lamb was eligible for the first time, and they were eligible to redo the Dak deal. They didn't. They dragged their feet all throughout 2023. They bet against themselves, and Dak Prescott finished second in MVP voting, and CeeDee Lamb had arguably the greatest statistical season that any Cowboys wide receiver has ever had. So instead of learning their lesson and swallowing their pride, once 2024 hit, they dragged those out all throughout the entire offseason. As you recall, Jerry Jones infamously said the team would go all in. They were coming off of the playoff loss to Green Bay. They let Mike McCarthy go at it in a contract year. I mean, they did just about anything and everything they could to stir the pot of turmoil and toxicity. And so that's why it wasn't a shock when last year was the disaster that it was. And so they did get the Dak deal done and the CeeDee Lamb deal done at the 11th hour, admittedly. But again, instead of learning that lesson at the beginning of this offseason, this 2025 calendar year, they dragged the Micah Parsons thing out. They let all these other competitors, Myles Garrett, Max Crosby, not Aiden Hutchinson, but just about everybody else, Trey Hendrickson, I suppose, excluded, get deals and elevate the market. And that particular situation reached such a boiling point, obviously, that they wound up trading him. And again, they wound up trading him and then getting panicky because of the Cowboys, and they were seeking their headlines, that they made deals at the deadline. And the Quinnen Williams one looks like it's going to work out. Again, I would not, argue that justified the process. The Micah Parsons trade could be won by the Cowboys. However, we look back on it in 10 years, it will never be justifiable to me. And so you can't keep cutting your nose off to spite your face. You can't keep throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so at some point there has to be some sort of franchise reset, because they've been behind and behind and behind. And instead of taking any moment to catch up and then get ahead, they've just let everything continue to mount. They built a poor foundation and then a poor initial structure and then a poor roof and then did a poor paint job. And lo and behold, the house sucks. I mean, that's not a surprise to anyone who was really paying attention the entire time.
Look, you mentioned there Quinnen Williams and the impact that he's already had in his brief time since moving over from the New York Jets. It feels like Logan Wilson's come in, and even though he wasn't getting game time in Cincinnati, he's still having an impact at a linebacker position that has really struggled this season on the defense. But I think mainly I wanted to take you back to the offseason, and we caught up, and I think it was around the time that they sorted a deal out for George Pickens, and there was a lot of skepticism about George Pickens and the impact that he could have. He's a fascinating character, really. You never really know what you're going to get, and maybe we've seen that with the noise, and especially the last week, and his sort of head-to-head with Richard Sherman. But when you assess the impact that George Pickens has had, how impressed have you been with that relationship that he's built with Dak Prescott on the field, and does that essentially make him a almost a go-to come the offseason, that they're going to get a deal done for George Pickens and instead of letting him test free agency. What do you make of that, RJ?
So just for context sake and for ownership's sake, I was against the trade because
Mm-hmm.
I took the cheese and we spoke about this in terms of what was coming out of Pittsburgh. And it wasn't that I was against George specifically. It was that for all reasons detailed, I did not trust the Cowboys to handle this. But that being said, when the trade happened that day, we went live on our YouTube channel and obviously we're analyzing it and assessing it. And I said, okay, look, I wouldn't have done this, but you've crossed this line, get the extension done right now, because that's the most logical way to handle this. It's illogical to, again, go at a contract year with a player who plays such a specifically important position. Now, no one, could have forecasted the year that he would have had. No one could have forecasted that CeeDee Lamb would miss time, which would exacerbate his opportunities to put together stats and games and heroic moments and whatnot. But that being said, I've obviously been very happy to eat some crow on this because, again, I did not think that these results would happen the way they have. But the reaction last week specifically, it's a very fun time to have this conversation. So many Cowboys fans who were down for the trade, who were proponents for the trade, have completely and totally, 180 degrees turned on this and said, I've seen enough. That outburst, not even outburst, the just poor effort last Thursday night against the Lions, just tag him in the offseason, whatnot. I don't want to deal with this. That to me is incredibly short-sighted. I think he has more than proven that his value. I think he has more than honed, for whatever you want to call were his misgivings and misguidances out of Pittsburgh. And I think he's earned a benefit of the doubt for me to give him a massive deal. And I would have done it back then, to be clear. I would have given him a market rate deal. And had the Cowboys done so, I think we'd be sitting here and saying, man, that was really visionary. That was really forward thinking. That was really logical. And it obviously did not happen. And to me, that kind of I want the Cowboys to extend George Pickens or get a new deal done with him in the offseason, to be very, very clear. But I'm also fascinated because he presents an incredible Rorschach test for them in the offseason, because we have, slowly given the franchise and the front office specifically a little bit of benefit of the doubt back as well for turning things around, for this impressive run we've seen. And look, again, I'm not saying anyone should hang a banner for what the Cowboys are accomplishing here. But if March comes, if before St. Patrick's Day arrives and they have a new deal done with George Pickens, we can objectively sit here and say, you know what, you've learned your lesson. You did not play the same stupid games. But if they drag this out, if they let this consume all of the attention and absorb all of the oxygen, all the first take headlines, it will be representative of the fact that everything we saw throughout this little run in 2025 was just good luck, good fortune, and the hard work of others, the hard work of Brian Schottenheimer and Dak Prescott and everybody who's associated with the field and the team on a game-to-game basis. And so he is fascinating in that particular respect. But yeah, I would get the deal done. I don't see any reason or any merit to not do so. And in fact, and again, I apologize for being long-winded, the Cowboys have a slight, if you want to call it, benefit of missing on their 2023 first-round draft pick. They took Mozzie Smith then, and he was part of the trade to get Quentin Williams, if you want to call him a part of it. I think that would be being kind and gracious. But because that was a miss, they do not have a 2023 first-rounder to negotiate a new deal with. The class of 2023 is going to be eligible for an extension for the first time, obviously, come the offseason, and that's when it would make the most sense to get a deal done. The way it did with Micah Parsons at his point of eligibility, first point of eligibility, the way it did with CeeDee Lamb in his first point of eligibility, and the ways the Cowboys did not do that. So there is quite literally no other player of extreme significance who the Cowboys have to take care of that is in-house. Obviously, we want to see the Cowboys address external free agency, but unlike the last few seasons where it's been, you got to take care of Micah and Deron Bland and Tyler Smith and Jake Ferguson or Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, the list is very, very, very short. So even more so, it underscores how there will be no justifiable reason if they let this George Pickens thing go to the 11th hour the way they have everyone before.
And when you look at the wide receiver position, especially when you look towards the 2026 free agent class, wide receivers top at their game right now are going to be highly sought after. So you can't afford essentially to let these guys hit free agency, and you've got to really tie them up. And that goes back to your point. When essentially this deal was done, you really should do it rather than wait. You're going to be paying a higher fee, as we all know. You wait, you're going to be paying that more. But in terms of that relationship that I mentioned he's built with Dak, Dak is having a phenomenal year. He's just incredibly impressive right now. The fact that he's sort of going toe-to-toe with Christian McCaffrey in the real battle for comeback player of the year, the Cowboys being the third highest scoring team in the NFL right now. Just tell me, from someone who's watched Dak so closely throughout this season, what has made him really so impressive and maybe stand out, especially, his 10th year in the NFL?
Yeah, I think there comes a point for every Cowboys fan. Are you a fan of How I Met Your Mother? Have you seen the TV show How I Met Your
I
Mother?
haven't seen it, I'm
Okay.
afraid. I'm aware of it, I know it,
Okay.
but I'm not an avid viewer.
So there's a trope in the show where one character talks about how when you notice an annoying habit about someone, which you don't have any of, Will,
Oh,
and
too kind.
how the proverbial glass sort of breaks for you, and you can no longer not be aware of it. If someone chews their gum loudly, if someone makes you aware of that, all of a sudden what was benign to you is now all you notice about that person. And so I think a weird inverse in terms of it being a positive thing has happened with Dak Prescott. There has been this season specifically, I would offer national and in this case international breakthrough where we have fought the good fight, trying to get people to recognize that Dak Prescott is more than the memes you see on Facebook, more than what does lead First Take or whatever the case may be. And so it does seem that a lot of people have come around to recognize, and in this way, I would argue that the Cowboys' insistency on being toxic as a front office has benefited him, because I think everyone has recognized, man, he is really swimming against the current in terms of his own building. And so I think that as that has happened, Dak has also reached a point of understanding, so what, right? I think he's been somewhat liberated by this overall effect of saying, people said going into the Detroit game, like this is massive. If they don't win this game, like everyone's going to really come for them. Okay, like you mean insert national international talk show is gonna say he sucks? Like you think he's really really worried about this? You think this has never happened to him before? I think that this team has a strange callus that is a heavy burden to carry, don't get me wrong, but in some respects can offer a bit of a shield and a bit of power, a bit of internal self-power, self-liberation is noted. And so I think that those factors have all kind of married in the right way. I don't know Dak on a personal level, but he's also become a father. He's also, evolved in terms of life. And I think he's, recognized that there are a lot of things happening at once. And I think he's ultimately just very in control and very comfortable with his standing personally, professionally. And he's, understanding and cognizant of the fact that he's putting in the work and doing what he can that is, to the limits of his control, but that there are external factors that have to happen. And if they don't break his way, I think he's at peace with that. And there's a lot of, again, power and self-liberation that comes with, realizing that in any walk.
And to be honest, it's not a new coaching staff essentially that's coming. Clayton Adams comes in, but really Brian Schottenheimer has reinvigorated, and it feels like maybe has built a culture that maybe has been waiting in Dallas. Look, we spoke in the offseason, didn't we? And I think the reaction, well, the overriding reaction to his appointment as the head coach was one of a bit of a shrug and going, is that really where the extensive head coaching search landed you with your offensive coordinator, a first-year head coach? How is this all going to go? A lot of skepticism. But from what I think I've seen personally from the outside looking in is it's a head coach who's reinvigorated this group. When you just see those post-game locker room speeches that he's giving, and it feels like all the team are fully bought in. And then from what I've seen on social media, it feels like a lot of fans have bought into him as well. Are you surprised with the impact that he's had so quickly?
Yeah, you said it was met with a shrug. I would categorically disagree. It was met with disdain and outrage. As
Maybe
I told
stronger
you,
than a shrug.
yeah, as I told you then, this is the Dallas Cowboys, an organization that thrives on attention, and they announced his hiring at 9 p.m. local on a Friday night. It was almost shameful. It was almost like they were hoping that no one noticed. So the coaching search was actually not extensive. We're in a moment here. I recognize the Bears lost last week, but for a moment in time, the Bears and Patriots held the number one seeds in each respective conference, and they're led by two coaches who were hired this past cycle. Neither of them were interviewed by the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys did not interview Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn. I recognize that things have not gone well with the Jets, but he was obviously a top and premier candidate at the time. They just kind of fell into this, which again is another representation of how results do not justify the process here. I think as this season has gone along and his personality has shown through, and people who were closer to the situation than I am had long said that would, if it worked, it would be because his personality kind of won people over. I equate it to, if you recall, when LeBron James returned to Cleveland after his stint in Miami. I remember LeBron saying at the time that he viewed Miami, and I know people feel different ways about him, but he viewed his time there as kind of going to college, as kind of a time where he needed to kind of grow and develop and mature as an adult, if you will, if you follow the analogy, and was ready to go home. And obviously we saw what he did, in his second stint in Cleveland. And I think that Mike McCarthy was kind of that for this core, for this nucleus. He was an opportunity to learn at the helm of someone who had been there and done that and seen the game's ultimate heights, literally in their building, as is well documented that he won his Super Bowl in those four walls. And I think that kind of prepared them to be in a position where they needed, a more passionate and not quite literally in this case, but a spiritual leader, someone to just kind of connect with them on that level, on that wavelength. And so I think, it was just a matter of right person, right time, right circumstances, right chemistry at this moment. Would he be having the same success if he got the Bears job or the Patriots job? I don't think so. I think that, again, it was a matter of circumstance and variables and, to be quite honest, coincidences. But it has been very, very, very cool and very, very fun. And I think his personality kind of gets the attention in the headlines, but he's also proven himself to be a fantastic offensive play caller. That was the question, to be quite honest, that we had, because he was going to, as he has, assume offensive play calling duties, and we hadn't seen him do that in for forever. And so he is very similar to Pete Carroll, who's a mentor of his, and he kind of copies his post-game routine. He's very inspired by Pete Carroll, and I think that was the effect we saw that Pete had in Seattle. Not to say that the same success awaits this Cowboys group that Seahawks team ultimately had, but you can definitely see the similarities. There is a college feel, college vibe, if you will, to his approach and his connection and relationships with players.
Final couple of questions from me, RJ. Really, really appreciate your time as ever. But you mentioned there about this almost level of disdain when Brian Schottenheimer was announced as the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys in the offseason. And I don't know, right now where I sit, I feel like there's a lot of positivity surrounding him, but maybe not the defensive coordinator in Matt Eberflus. And I just wanted to sort of get a rain check on where the perception of him is right now, as it feels like there is a lot of frustration, but essentially, has he been curtailed by the level of talent on this defense? Or right now, from what you're seeing, is he putting himself in jeopardy when it comes to a potential coaching change in the offseason at the defensive coordinator position? What have you seen from Matt Eberflus in this first year?
To explain the disdain, everything generally comes from the same source for Cowboys fans, and that's disdain for Jerry Jones, disdain for the Jones family. And that was where the Brian Schottenheimer hire, disdain came from the perspective of the Joneses are clearly, this was the take at the time. The Joneses are clearly hiring a puppet, someone they can control. They don't want to hire a Ben Johnson, someone who would demand control, who would want to do it their way. The Jones just want to, keep, their MO the way it's been for the entire drought period, which is why the drought is what it is. Again, that has not necessarily proven to be the case, or even if it is the case, Brian Schottenheimer is succeeding in spite of it. So people are willing to kind of look past it. Matt Eberflus has a history with the Cowboys, was previously on their staff, and I was and somewhat remain excited for his time as defensive coordinator. He long deserved the title of defensive coordinator during his first stint at the Cowboys, because they have their friends, because they have their close personalities, would not relent on giving it to Rod Marinelli. Rod Marinelli held it, but Matt Eberflus kind of did the work and left for the job in Indianapolis, if you recall, when Josh McDaniels was initially hired to take the Colts job and then bowed out. And that's why, we were so excited about Matt Eberflus, because he succeeded in that particularly chaotic environment. And so I think right now, because they're not performing well, it's easy to take the low-hanging fruit in saying, well, he's a friend of the Jones family, so we don't like him. He's a friend of theirs and whatnot, so he sucks. He's a loser. Brian Schottenheimer should get to hire his guy. He hired Clayton Adams. Look how that's working out. If you let him have that same level of control and influence, it could be a similar sort of effect. That's kind of the general sense for a lot of people, in my opinion. I have gone to bat for Matt Eberflus, which is, Jon Snow facing the entire army sort of proposition. And my reasoning is that it's not easy to coach or to play for the Cowboys for obvious reasons. There's meddling that happens and whatnot. But beyond all of that, he did not have his best player throughout his entire roster on the defensive side of the ball, specifically for any part of the offseason or any part of training camp. And then they ripped him away a literal 7 days before the season began. And so beyond all of that, beyond the fact that the Micah stuff happened, so much of the defensive success was built upon and predicated upon DeMarvion Overshown returning from a utterly significant, horrible injury, and he is back. But that is kind of, what are you doing building such a strong foundation on top of what appears to be a weak point, in terms of your roster? And Savon Ravel, who was their third round pick, who is coming back from a torn ACL, and they are back. And now he has Quinnen Williams. And there was a lot of jumping to, oh, look, this 3-game winning streak, they're having success. Matt Eberflus rocks. I don't think that we can properly assess or evaluate Matt Eberflus because, again, this was just incredibly inconsistent. He was dealing in utter turmoil throughout the entire season. So I'm willing to give him some slack and benefit of the doubt just because of the circumstances. That being said, beyond all of that, there is a sector of, Matt Eberflus is their third defensive coordinator in as many years because Dan Quinn left and Mike Zimmer was a part of Mike McCarthy's lame duck year. And so there is pushback on wanting to hire a fourth in as many years. And so that's kind of working in his favor. There's also the fact that the Cowboys don't generally fire coaches and pay them to not obviously be a part of their organization. So I think people are, he's the easy, figure to blame because, to your point, they've come around on Brian Schottenheimer because there is this general consensus that Dak Prescott's playing well. This particular moment in time, I would say target number 1 is Matt Eberflus and target number 2 is George Pickens, just because of the effort people saw against Detroit.
And like you say, if you're fighting for a playoff spot and the season maybe hasn't gone to expectations as you hope right now, there's always going to be at some point a fall guy, like you say, right. And maybe that is falling on the shoulders of Matt Eberflus. So to Sunday Night Football then, going up against the Minnesota Vikings, they've had a tumultuous season right now, sit 5-8, all of the questions surrounding JJ McCarthy and Kevin O'Connell and their expectations. But like we mentioned, the Cowboys need to focus on getting their job done. They need to win the 4 games they have remaining, and it falls on Sunday Night Football under the lights. Look, I know you guys did a great piece on Blogging the Boys looking at the potential matchups that are going to be the most interesting, especially looking at this game. Maybe it's Deron Bland going up against Justin Jefferson. Maybe it's having to deal with Aaron Jones, who has a great record against the Cowboys. What are you most looking forward to, and what key matchup are you looking forward to assessing when it comes to Sunday night?
I honestly do think it comes down to JJ McCarthy in a Rorschach test sort of way. He's obviously become a bit of a personality, on the internet. And so there is this kind of general assumption that he's not this, he's not that. And early on in the season, the Cowboys were the magic elixir for that, right? The Cowboys were, are you struggling? Don't worry, because you get to play the Cowboys defense soon enough and you're going to shine. I mean, it feels like forever ago now, but Russell Wilson had over 400 yards against this defense. I mean, that's the same Russell Wilson who a Giants reserve coaching staff won't even have, active on their roster. And so I mean, that to me is kind of representative of how this is going to go. I'm not even really so much worried about, I know these are famous last words, but about Justin Jefferson. I'm more so worried about JJ McCarthy on the run and getting mobile and converting these 3rd and 7s, these 3rd and 4s and whatnot, and just keeping the Vikings on the field and keeping the Cowboys off the field, the Cowboys offense, obviously. And so you mentioned Aaron Jones. I also, there are a lot of Murphy's Law moments for the Cowboys. And Aaron Jones, you mentioned he has a great history. He's quite the troll. I mean, when he wins against the Cowboys, he rubs it in. And so you could close your eyes and see him, have a 3-touchdown game. I mean, you could see him, win a fantasy playoff matchup for a lot of people in that respect and whatnot, or people saying like, I was the 1 seed in my fantasy league and I lost because my opponent had Aaron Jones against the Cowboys. Like, it just kind of does have that taste potentially. And it would be very classic Cowboys, no pun intended at the cap that I'm wearing today, for the Eagles to lose to the Raiders and for them to get that help on Sunday afternoon and then drop this, winnable game against the Vikings, because the Cowboys are favored. It's moved around a little bit all week, 5.5, 6.5, whatever. They were favored against Chicago. They were favored against Carolina. They were favored against Arizona at home, and they lost all 3 of those games. And so I think they'll win. I think they'll win handily. In fact, I think this is the game where they, I'm not quite saying literally 52-17 type win, but this is a comfortable blowout win where they do keep everyone excited and interested and invigorated and, keep hope and conversation alive that they could pull this off. It might be next week that, the clock strikes midnight and Cinderella's all of a sudden struggling and looking around for help. But if they lose, I do think it's because they let JJ McCarthy get the best of them and relight the conversation that maybe JJ McCarthy is the answer for Minnesota.
Final question from me then, RJ. Look, Brian Schottenheimer said just in the last couple of days that if the Cowboys aren't to make the playoffs, then this season isn't a success. But I wonder from a different perspective, when you look at a first-year head coach coming in, taking over the play-calling responsibilities, for this offense to be clicking into gear how it was, the fact that we've spoken about Matt Eberflus having to basically having his best defensive player taken away from him, and this defense then having to bounce back. If the Cowboys are to win the final 4 games of the season, like you mentioned earlier, they would win 7 of their last 8 games and take that winning feeling and momentum into next season. So do you feel like without the playoffs, has this, if the Cowboys are to be unsuccessful in making the postseason, is there a way that this season is still a success?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for me, it stretches a bit beyond even the Super Bowl, as I alluded to a little while ago. Even if they lost one of these 4, even if I mean, if we're sitting here, they don't have to win 7 of 8 for it to be deemed impressive in my mind. If they win 5 of 8, I mean, that is objectively impressive. But if let's say they go 3-1 down this stretch and cost themselves a playoff spot, whatever, maybe they even get the help they would have needed from the Eagles. That will be bitter. That will be a bitter pill to swallow. But to me, if they pass with just a passing grade across the rest of the season and they get the George Pickens deal done, I will believe. I will legitimately, I won't go buy the foam cowboy hat or anything like that, but I will legitimately believe that you are no longer headed completely and totally due south. That is truly where my point of trust will be earned or lost once more. And that applies even if they win the division, even if they go 4-0 and the Eagles lose every game, right? Even if they want a playoff game, right? Even if we extend things to the most optimistic possible literal potential result that could exist for them this season, the most important thing beyond their own internal momentum, internal composition, internal disposition, and belief in what they're able to do, they're ultimately at the behest of the people up above at the front office. And if the front office is hell-bent on stirring the pot and, again, contaminating and sabotaging the team in different ways, then that's going to hold them back regardless of how good they are on the field. And so I obviously want them to do well and win out and get the help that they need. But the true inflection point, the nearest fork in the road, is how Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones handle George Pickens. That will tell us whether or not we're still dealing with children or if, they're starting to mature a little bit.
Look, can't wait for the final 4 games of the regular season. Looking forward to just plenty of football, and especially Sunday night as well with the Cowboys taking on the Vikings. RJ, as ever, is an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Have an amazing Christmas. Thank you so much for joining us on talkSPORT USA. Looking forward to seeing what the Cowboys do these last 4 games of the season.
Likewise, Merry Christmas and Happy Christmas. And, that's what Harry Potter told me is appropriate in your part of the world. So thank you for your friendship and your relationship. We really appreciate it. And hopefully these final 4 games are interesting.